Of the book of Esther. So these three books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, are at the end of Old Testament history. As I've told you, if your Bibles were to be arranged chronologically, these would be back there with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi right at the end. And while the books of Ezra and Nehemiah show us what was going on in Jerusalem at this time, the book of Esther shows us some things that are taking place in Persia. And so it's a bit of a different, you might say, a different perspective. This book takes place, as it says, in the days of Ahasuerus, and he reigned from 485 to 465 BC. And so the events of this book were taking place in the days when Ezra returned to Jerusalem. You remember that the book of Ezra is 10 chapters. The first 6 chapters cover the return from Babylonian captivity under Zerubbabel, and then chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10 cover a second return of the Jews to Jerusalem under the leadership of Ezra. So that's when these events are taking place, but instead of Jerusalem, we're in Persia. The key thought, I would say, in this book, and we'll talk about this for a bit, but the key thought for this book is the providence of God among the Jewish nation during this time. And and I suppose you know, what is the unique feature of Esther, of this book? The name of God is never mentioned, and there's different suppositions as to why. The writings in chapter 2 and the chronicles of the king, verse 23, that would be the chronicles of the kings of Persia. There are those who think that what's recorded in the book of Esther is part of that. And so if it's part of the chronicles of the Persian king, it would make sense that the name of the Israelite God is not in there. But some people have trouble with that. The book of Esther is one that was not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 in the Qumran Valley. Some people struggle with that, well, if it wasn't there, then it must not be inspired and doesn't deserve to be in the Bible. But there are multiple Jewish witnesses to what we've been studying on Sunday nights. There are multiple early, and by early I mean first century Jewish witnesses to the canonicity of the book of Esther. And so it's and I suppose you could say this with many books of the Bible, that it's been in question by some as to why it's even in the Bible, but by and large, it's not been left out of those what we call the list of books that were accepted as authoritative and recognized as the canon of Scripture. So that's what we've been talking about on Sunday nights. And by the way, I told you, let me do this real quick. I told you that we've stopped doing the Q&As on every Sunday night, and that the last Sunday nights of each month are going to be used for questions and answers. And so I've got some questions that have been turned in, and I'm looking at them now. I may do them next Sunday night. I've got four good questions here that were turned in. So I may do those next Sunday night because I've already got tonight what we're going to do, and it's an important part of what we're already involved in. So we'll do tonight what we were going to do anyway. And then next Sunday night, I'm going to deal with some questions that have been turned in about the subject matter that we've been dealing with on Sunday evenings. Anyway, back to Esther. So, the providence of God among the Jewish nation. Again, this is from the Persian perspective and what's going on in the court of Ahasuerus and in the administration somewhat of Ahasuerus. And so that's why some believe that the name of the Israelite God is not mentioned in the text, because if it was, again, chapter 2 and verse 23, part of a Persian chronicle of Jewish activities, it would make sense that, again, that they wouldn't necessarily mention the Jewish God, but just recording the events that were taking place. Well, a unique feature is that the name of God is not mentioned in the book, and we'll discuss that a bit as we go through. Any questions or comments before I go any further in the outline here? All right, so 10 chapters, and this is everything pretty much is centered around the same theme, and that is the survival of the Jewish people under Persia. Of course, it initially was Babylonian captivity, but the Persians took over, you might say, and we read about that in the book of Daniel. And Jews are still there. They're still in Persia. They're still serving in the court. And Esther becomes one of those individuals. And so the events of this book, as you probably well know, are just really centered around a couple of things that take place and the response of the Jewish people that are part of the process of their, if you want to say, survival during this time of difficulty. So the book opens up. We're introduced to Ahasuerus and how powerful and expansive his empire is, over 120 provinces. And as you notice, from India to Ethiopia. And so a very, very powerful empire. And it's interesting because, Daniel, what the book of Daniel does is lay out for us world history from the days of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon until the day of Rome and the Roman Empire. And every prophecy in the book of Daniel is bracketed by those four empires. And this is, the Persians are the empire that followed, remember the head of gold in the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw. And a very powerful nation and a very excessive nation. I guess that'd be the good word to use here. In chapter 1, Ahasuerus throws a feast, verse 3, for all of his princes. And this is an opportunity for a monarch to show his wealth and his power, you might say, but also the ladies of the kingdom, if you will, have their own feast, and Vashti the queen does that. Now, part of this feast, naturally, is drinking, verse 8, and one of the things is, the drinking was, all of the vessels were different, and the drinking was not compulsory. In other words, they didn't force you to drink, but what do you think is going to happen when a bunch of powerful people get together and start drinking? Well, I would say, look at Washington, D.C., and that will answer that question. Have a bunch of drunks. But anyway, in this feast, Ahasuerus is merry with wine. He's drunk. His cohorts, if you will, they're in the same state. And so the king, on the seventh day, chapter 1 and verse 10, he wants to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. And what this event does here kind of launches us into Esther's actions or activities during this time. Well, of course, she refuses, and that you don't refuse a king. And she refused to do that. Chapter 1 and verse 12, and his anger, he was very wroth, and his anger burned within him. He was in the Hebrew indicates it was like a heated furnace. He was, as we say, he was fired up about this. And so they begin, the king and the wise men, verse 13, okay, so how do we handle this? Well, look down at verse 17. It says, "For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes when it shall be reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not." So she's going to have a kingdom-wide influence by her refusal to do what the king says. So they dethrone her, and then you start reading in chapter 2, well, we've got to have a new queen. Esther is one of these beautiful young virgins that are chosen to, for 12 months, go through a state of preparation to appear before the king. And as you read these accounts, it reminds me of like Joseph, and it reminds me of Daniel. She obtains favor above everybody else. And again, while the name of God is not mentioned throughout this text, to deny the special providence of God is, well, it would be to be blind to what's taking place here, because she is chosen above everybody else, and she finds favor with the king, and she's able then, because of the favor she finds with him, to do things that other people weren't typically permitted to do, and things work out, you might say, because of her bravery. So, well, somebody else we're introduced to is her uncle, and his name is Mordecai. We learn in the text that her parents died. He took her then and raised her as his own daughter. And one of the things that we learn about these two is that they do not tell. Well, look at chapter 2. I was trying to word it properly. Look at chapter 2 and verse 19. Somebody read that for us. And 20. Chapter 2, verses 19 and 20.
When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, but just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the commandment of Mordecai when she was brought up by him.
Okay, so they're keeping it quiet that they're of Jewish descent, which kind of makes sense because the Jews are the captives still. But it's interesting to me, too, because you have men like who have served previously in political positions, you might say. Again, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You've got people that are influential like that in the kingdom. And of course, Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer. He had influence in the royal court, you might say. But Mordecai and Esther keep it under wraps of who their people are. Well, as they're going through this process of picking the next queen, Mordecai, the Jew, as he's identified throughout the text, hears a plot to kill the king, and the king Ahasuerus is made aware of what's going to take place. And that's kind of where that ends. If you look at chapter 2 and verse 23, okay, they find out who it was, and they hang them, and this was written in the Chronicles. So that's kind of the end of the story at that point in time in the text. Well, in the meantime, you read through chapter 3, and Esther has obtained her position. This event that Mordecai revealed has been kept under wraps. But then we run into this guy, this Persian by the name of Haman, and he's quite a... Well, he's obviously a powerful man in the kingdom. Chapter 3 and verse 1, Ahasuerus was going to promote Haman, advanced him, and set him above all the princes that were with him. Everybody bowed down to Haman, except for who? Mordecai. And, well, that doesn't, you could imagine, the arrogance that goes along with the position, you might say. That does not sit well with Mordecai, with Haman, that Mordecai the Jew is not bowing down to me. So instead of determining just, I'll take care of Mordecai, get him out of the way, what is Haman's plot, if you will, to get back at Mordecai for his perceived insubordination? What is Haman determined to do? All right, I'm not just going to kill him, I'm going to kill all of his people. And so this plot now is built, and again, as you read this text and having a larger understanding of the Bible and the providence of God, particularly as you read the Old Testament, again, I mentioned earlier, accounts like Joseph and Daniel and Daniel's three associates, and how they behaved themselves and how they obtained favor and advanced even among their enemies, Jewish enemies, with all of that broader knowledge, we look at the book of Esther and we see the same kind of thing happening. And so Haman is he plans to do this, but then as you advance to chapter 4, Mordecai again hears about all this. He begins mourning the decree, cried with a loud and bitter cry, came even before the king's gate, chapter 4 and verse 2, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth, and in every province whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning. So that, again, this isn't just going to happen to Mordecai. It's not just going to happen there in the palace. This announcement, this determination that Haman has made, the king permits it to go to all 127 provinces of Persia. And so throughout the land you have the Jews mourning. And as you continue reading chapter 4, of course, Esther then learns about the plot. And she's the queen. But here again, thinking about the providence of God, how she has obtained favor above everybody else that was chosen to go through those preparations to, I guess you'd say, be on display for whoever would become queen. She makes it. She becomes the queen. Her uncle Mordecai, as they learn about this plot, they begin communicating with each other. And Mordecai puts the challenge to her of, and this is all in chapter 4, you've got to do something. And look at chapter 4, verse 13 beginning. Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. You know, once it's found out that you're one of us, basically, you're done too. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, notice the statement of faith here, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. It will happen. And but you and your father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth? And here's this statement that I would say most people, when they read the book of Esther and they think about the providence of God, this is the statement that they hone in on. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Well, the idea of providence, so I don't know, maybe it was a couple of years ago, I did a couple of lessons here on the difference between the providential and the miraculous. Okay, so miracles were, you remember the three letters, IOU, immediate, observable, and undeniable. And the providential actions of God are not always immediate or observable or undeniable. And that's kind of the thought here in Esther 4 and verse 14. Who knows whether you are come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And of course, you've read the book of Esther, so you know ultimately what happens in time. Esther, what does Esther do in view of what he says to her here? What is her response? She does it. But one thing that you learn throughout the book of Esther is you don't go to the king unless you're summoned. Well, she had not been, and so she's essentially taking her life in her own hands to do this. But again, as the text points out, she obtained favor with the king. And so you look here at chapter 4 and the end of verse 16. She determines, I will, and so will I go unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. You know, we've got to do something, because it's been determined that our people are going to be destroyed if somebody doesn't do something. And so it's interesting the way that she does this. You read chapter 5. What's the little plot that she comes up with, you might say? How is she going to reveal this plan to Haman's plan to destroy the Jews? What is her method to bring all this out? Yeah, she's going to appeal to Haman. I would say particularly, she's going to appeal to Haman's arrogance. I want to have a feast for Ahasuerus and for Haman. And of course, we understand, having again read the book, that is when the plot is revealed. during that time. Now here's the thing, too, that kind of clues us into what kind of person Haman is. Chapter 5 and verse 9, he hears about this feast that she's going to have to supposedly honor him. And so chapter 5, verse 9, he goes out, he's joyful and a glad heart, but what? Now there's Mordecai. And Mordecai, again, he will not bow to him. He didn't stand up nor move for him. And he was full of indignation against Mordecai. This reminds me so much of remember Ahab when he wanted Naboth's vineyard? Of course, Ahab's king of Israel. And he wants this vineyard that's right next door to him, and he can't have it, so he went home and cried, didn't he? He laid down on his bed and cried and told his wife what he wanted. And so his wife, Jezebel, had the dirty work done. I see a lot of the same personality, you might say, with Haman. He talks about all of his, verse 11, the glory, the riches, the multitude of his children, everything he has, and this banquet. But there's just one thing in life that's really, gnawing on me. All this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the gate. And that shows you how small of a person Haman is. And, I guess you might say how careful we ought to be about all the blessings that we have in life, all the good things that we have, and one bad thing. I guess you'd call this a bad thing. One perceived slight that we receive in life can just overshadow all the good things that we have in life. All the blessings are forgotten. All of that's worthless because one thing doesn't go the way I think it should go.
Why was he so jealous and so upset about Mordecai because of the Jews?
Well, I think because he's a Jew, but also because of his personality. He's just he's a spoiled. Yeah, Haman. That's the best word I could think. He's spoiled, has everything handed to him, and this one little thing, he just can't take it. And so he, of course, determines we're going to kill him. And that seems to be quite the solution for all of these types of things. So they're going to build a gallows 50 cubits high. Of course, a cubit is about 18 inches, so 75 feet high, and that's what he wants to hang Mordecai on. So we have the feast then. That's planned. But in the and again, to me, as you read chapter 6, here's another instance or example, if you will, of the providence of God, because there happens to be a night when Ahasuerus can't sleep. So what did he do since he can't sleep? Okay, he wants some reading done. And, he just happens to read that Mordecai, chapter 6 here in verse 2, had saved his life. And it's like, did we ever do anything for that guy? Well, no, of course. So who does Ahasuerus call to honor Mordecai? Haman. Well, isn't that, I guess from my perspective, I would say, isn't that appropriate? And so he asked him some questions. What should the king do to honor such a person like this? And the whole time Haman's thinking it's him. Well, he said, no, I want you to do this for Mordecai the Jew. And you could imagine how that went with Haman, with the kind of man that he was anyway. So Haman is ultimately, of course, hanged, and the Jews are delivered. And I know that's a very short summary, but I want to look at some things here in the outline real quick. 3 lessons from Esther. Number 1, I put in there Vashti's example for all women and her willingness to sacrifice even her throne for her what? For her virtue. And, there are a lot of passages in the New Testament that talk about godly women. I put 1 Peter 3. You can think of 1 Timothy chapter 2. The concept of modesty and you might say appropriate behavior. Well, those princes were right that Ahasuerus was honoring there in chapter 1. She's going to have an influence on other women. Well, that's true. And you think about Christian women today and the influence that you can have on each other, but then also other women who are not Christians by your conduct. And that's what 1 Peter 3 talks about. It's not necessarily that the woman preaches to her husband all the time, because eventually he's going to shut her off and quit listening. But she's going to, by her, as the King James says, her chaste conduct coupled with fear can win her husband. And so I think that's kind of a principle that we take from the book of Esther, that godly women, and I'm not saying that Vashti was a godly woman, but at least she was modest and wasn't willing to come before a bunch of drunken men and parade herself around like some kind of trophy to be won. Well, that is an example. Number 2, the preservation of the Jews by the courage of Mordecai and Esther. Again, literally taking her life into her hands to go before the king without his having summoned her. And of course, that's chapter 7 that we read. And then the providence of God toward his people in a foreign land. So once Haman is hanged and all of the plot to kill all of the Jews was revealed to Ahasuerus, he permits all the Jews all over the 127 provinces to protect themselves, and they do that. And they put to death their enemies. And so it is during that time that this feast is established. And I suppose this is one of the main parts of the book of Esther, talking about the Jewish celebration of what's called Purim. And that is a feast that is based off of the casting of lots. And I looked it up. This next year, it's going to be celebrated on March 16th and 17th. And it's named because Haman had cast lots to determine when to destroy the Jews from Persia. And of course, all of that plot got flipped on its head with the efforts of Mordecai and Esther. But then also, again, not just their efforts alone, but I would say, one of the things that I pointed out in Ezra and Nehemiah is that both of those authors talk about the good hand of God that was upon them. And remember, those two books are revealing what was going on in Jerusalem. Esther's revealing what's going on over in Persia, and you see the same concept of the good hand of their God upon them, providence. And so, the book of Esther records, the establishment of this feast that is still celebrated today. 2,500 years later. Here's what they do. They read the book of Esther. Each person gives money to at least 2 poor people, but they also send food to at least 1 poor person, and they drink wine. So it's a celebration. Now, you notice, let me see here, in the end of chapter 8, somebody read Esther 8, verse 17, please. 16 and 17. Okay, so obviously they are preserved, but then what you read there at the end, Donna notes that even some non-Jews became Jews because of what the Jews were doing. And that was not an uncommon occurrence. You could convert, I guess that's the term we use, you could convert to Judaism, but then you were bound to the law of Moses, and the law of Moses actually talks about that in like the books of Exodus and Leviticus. So that's what the book of Esther does. It records all of those events that led up to the preservation of the Jewish people in Persia. And here's one of the big things too, I suppose. So God has promised, since the Garden of Eden, you might say, since Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden, that there was going to come a seed who would crush the head of the serpent. All right, that's Genesis 3:15. And that's your first prophecy that's in regard to the coming of Christ. And then there are a multitude of prophecies throughout the Old Testament of the coming of Christ and the coming of this kingdom that would, like Daniel revealed in Daniel 2, that would never be destroyed. It would encompass the entire world. One of the very specific prophecies, though, is not only of the birth of Christ, that there was, like Isaiah 7:14 says, that a virgin would bring forth a son, and that they would call his name Emmanuel, which being interpreted as God with us. And you have all of those prophecies. But then you have a very specific prophecy in Micah chapter 5 and verse 2 about the place of the birth of Christ. So all of these, somebody turn over there to Micah 5, by the way, and I'll have you read verse 2 in just a second. But all of these events, the Babylonian captivity, the Jewish people are essentially wiped out. A few of the poorest people are left in the land. The city of Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. People are removed and taken to Babylon and scattered to the wind. As Ezekiel tells us, the captives would just be scattered all over the nations. But somebody read Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, please. Today. Okay, so not only do we have the prophecies of the birth of Christ, but you have it nailed down by Micah, Bethlehem of Ephratah, a small region among Judah, that he's going to come, the one who is from everlasting is going to come forth from that region. So Jesus is born. You advance now to the gospel accounts, particularly Matthew's account, and his birth is recorded in Matthew chapter 1. Herod the king's trying to find out, okay, where is this king of the Jews born? Where is he? I want to honor him. Well, we know he didn't want to honor him. He wanted to kill him. So he calls his wise men together. And do you remember what the wise men did? And not the wise men who went to see. We're talking about the wise men in Herod's court. Do you remember what they did? They went to Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. You read it in Matthew chapter 2. They said, well, the prophets said that they quote for Herod what you just read. So we know he was born there. And then, of course, things progress from there. But Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther record the return of the people from Babylon and Persia to the Promised Land. Because if the Jews had not been in the Promised Land, what problem do you run into? The birth of Christ. And so, that's what I say. It's kind of like Psalm 119, 160 says, the sum of thy word is truth. The totality of Scripture, when you look at the book of Esther and you read of all the accounts and you understand the prophecies of the birth of Christ, down to the birthplace of Christ, and the survival of the Jews under the Persian Empire, it all comes together, and you see there's a purpose behind this, and it reveals things to us. And that's what the book of Esther does. The preservation of the Jewish people during the Persian Empire. They were preserved from Babylon. There was a remnant. They're now preserved from Persia, and it continues even after that. Yes, when they celebrate the Feast of Purim today, they still read the book of Esther. Yep. Yeah, she was done. She defied the king, so they put her out. All right, appreciate your attention.